Hey guys, it's Toniko Pantoja, and lately I've been revisiting my fundamentals of drawing because I'm realizing that I have some weaknesses, and those weaknesses revolve around my fundamental understanding of drawing, and it's starting to affect my professional work, so I get a lot of notes revolving around this stuff. It's because of that I'm on this quest to make videos reflecting on addressing some of those things I do struggle with, and one of those things is perspective. I've been revisiting books, I've been restudying Loomis, I've been doing a lot of self-studies, so a lot of this stuff is fresh in my mind. First of all, why is perspective important? It grounds everything together in a scene, giving everything form, depth, and visual information. It is a foundation of solid drawing. In animation, perspective is important in almost every department, especially in drawing related departments such as animation, layout, storyboarding, design, backgrounds. Not only is it important, but behind the scenes, it can also be used as visual math, figuring out maintaining proportions of a character in a scene, using perspective as measurement tools, or how to break down reference to just its bare bones. The great thing about perspective, as Spencer Wan once said, is that it's a universal language of drawing, meaning it can be internationally understood. So I want to make multiple parts talking a bit about perspective because there's a lot of things I can say about each part, but I'm trying to condense it to my line of work. So first of all, let's talk about the horizon line. What is the horizon line? Imagine seeing a place where there is nothing but the sky and the ground. A great example is going to the beach and looking straight into the ocean. You just see the sky and the ocean. The fine line of where the sky and the surface meet is the horizon line, also known as the eye line or the eye level because it determines the height level of one's point of view. If you place the horizon line closer to the top, it feels like we are looking down. The same thing if we were to move the horizon line lower, it'll give the impression that we're looking up. If we were to take this concept into a side profile of a person, the eye line or the horizon line stays in place. But in that person's point of view, the horizon line is either moving up or down. The horizon line always follows the eye level of the camera. By tilting the horizon line, you get a Dutch angle. Imagine tilting your own head. The whole world would be slanted. Now here's why perspective is great for visual problem solving. Let's take a figure of a man, and we're going to add multiple copies of the man, with all of them being the same height and size. However, we're going to place them all over the scene, placing them in different depths, some of them being closer to us and some of them being further away from us. We're going to resize them with the power of digital tools for the time being. Also, all these guys are on the same plane. As a rule of showing consistency, all figures must match their body parts to the horizon line. So for this case, we're going to make the horizon line meet their eyes. Now, we've suggested that all of these dudes, same height, standing on the same surface, are all spread out. This is great for when you're trying to place characters all over the scene and you want to keep them consistent. Now let's do another take where we make the horizon line match the figure's crotch or waist area. This gives the impression that us, the viewer, is kneeling, with our heads or eyes matching the level of the crotch or the pelvis. Even without a background or perspective grid lines, there are already hints of depth by how consistent these figures are to the horizon line. If we didn't make all of our figures match body parts in the horizon line, so some on the head, some on the waist, some on the chest, we've obscured consistency. Something like this would only work if the figures are on different levels of the set, or some figures were either sitting or doing some other action that has them elevated or lower to the ground. Without a background, it's hard to determine the depth and foundation of a set. But when I storyboard or do thumbnails, a horizon line is enough for me to determine whether a shot is a high angle or a low angle shot. This is enough information that when I show it to my directors or supervisors or clients of what I'm going for, they have enough information to determine what they're looking at. As a practice, I'd recommend doing sketches of scenes. Whether it's cafe sketches or sketches of scene ideas, indicate your horizon line to establish it. If you're doing cafe sketches, for example, try making the horizon line the same height level of your own eyes. So let's say you're sketching and there are people standing and your eye level meets their hips. There's a huge chance that other figures that share a similar height would have their pelvis match the horizon line. But it already gives you a reference of what parts are you looking up and what parts are you looking down. It's already going to establish what's under you and what's over you. So the horizon line by itself is pretty crucial, especially when it comes to the brainstorming or rough stages of drawing. But there's more to perspective than horizon lines. Next, let's talk about vanishing points. This is where perspective becomes perspective. They are your guides to giving depth. Vanishing points is where you can make your grid lines in a scene to give it depth and eventually building the foundation of your set and scene. They can be overly complex with multiple vanishing points or as simple as possible. And I'm really just going to be talking about the simple ones because I think once you get the hang of the basics of a vanishing point, that can be applied to as many vanishing points as you want. But to be honest with you guys, I only use about 1 or 2 vanishing points, at most 3, but I usually stick to 1 or 2 vanishing points. And those are the vanishing points I'm going to be talking about: the 1-point perspective, the 2-point perspective, and the 3-point perspective, with the latter being more complicated. Now, another thing that I'd like to see vanishing points as is that you're establishing rules for your perspective drawings. Drawings can have an infinite space, but when you're adding perspective points, you're giving your world a little guideline to follow. Let's talk about the 1-point perspective. This is the most simple point of perspective in perspective drawing. 1-point perspective are like centered hallway shots, such as corridors, alleyways, or just in general flat staging shots. The 1-point perspective is used for shots and scenes that are considered flat staging. That doesn't mean that they don't have depth, as they can have visual information such as foreshortening, soft focus, and size differences to show depth, but they're considered flat because you're just looking straight. But the vanishing point isn't always centered. First, let's indicate our horizon line, or our eye level. Next, let's indicate a vanishing point in this drawing. You can put it anywhere you want in the horizon line, but I'm going to put mine somewhere offset to the left. Then I'm going to indicate my grid lines converging to this point. Next, we're going to put horizontal lines below and above the horizon line. The closer we are to the horizon line, the smaller the spacing these lines get. As you can see now, we've established a bit of depth. Maybe it's not the most accurate, but it's enough to work with. Again, we can do the same thing with vertical lines, now giving more information of depth. By doing this alone, we've already prepared something to work off with to allow us to draw something in a 1-point perspective. We can now use this as a guide to draw our background or work on 1-point perspective related shots. You can draw a hallway or a little room for yourself. Maybe draw little boxes and props using the vanishing point as a guide. I'm going to draw just a bunch of boxes using the vanishing points as a guide. Feel free to join me on this one, by the way. I'm just going to draw them in different sizes and varying depths. Some are far away and some are very close to the camera. Some boxes are above the horizon line and some below, which makes some boxes feel like we're looking underneath them and some boxes looking like we're looking over them. As you can see, the walls align towards the vanishing point. Anything else falls to horizontal lines. The vertical lines serve as height. So I really recommend you just practicing with the 1-point perspective until it becomes natural or it becomes familiar. And look, the 1-point perspective is a type of perspective that I like to use a lot. Now let's talk about 2-point perspective. In a 2-point perspective, instead of just one vanishing point, we now have 2. 2-point perspective shots are great when you want to show a little bit of depth. Things are a little more angled and a bit more off-centered. 2-point perspective offer more spatial information than a 1-point perspective. Now, when you introduce a new vanishing point, this is where you can exaggerate the field of view depending on where you put your vanishing point and how close the vanishing points are together. Now, like I did with my first example, I'm going to draw the horizon line first, and then I'm going to add 2 vanishing points. And I'm going to give them great distance between them. And like we did with our 1-point perspective, draw grid lines converging to your vanishing points. And for this case, I'm going to do it for each of these 2 vanishing points. Now, unlike the first example, we just did our lines converging into one vanishing point and just did lines that were just straight horizontals. Now, the straight horizontals for a 2-point perspective are actually lines for the other vanishing point. So yeah, once we've established our grid lines that converge into each of our vanishing points, I'm just going to try drawing boxes like we did in our first example. The same exercise. We're going to draw our boxes corresponding to the perspective line and the vanishing points. You'll notice the big difference between the 1-point and the 2-point is that there are more angles that you have to consider. One side of the wall isn't just facing straight at us, it's actually converging to the other vanishing point. This is something that I encourage you guys to keep practicing, keep playing around with it until it feels familiar. If you want to experiment more with this exercise, try drawing buildings, try drawing houses using your vanishing points. But once you get a good grasp of the 1-point and the 2-point perspective starts to become a bit more straightforward. Okay, let's talk about the 3-point perspective. I personally rarely use 3 points, but they are excellent in showing scale and dynamism. 3 points are great for big master shots with an emphasis of field of view. Whether you're looking up or down, the perspective starts to feel a bit more forced and pushed. Imagine that you're on the rooftop of a giant skyscraper and you're looking down. Or maybe you're at the first floor and you're looking up at these monolithic skyscrapers. Now, I've drawn these 2 examples as 2-point perspective, and while there is scale and there is depth, it does feel a little more graphic and flat. But with the 3-point perspective, we force perspective and depth using 3 vanishing points. The way we are going to prepare this is the same as we did for the 2-point perspective and the 1-point perspective. Our third vanishing point, however, will not sit on the same horizon line. We'll put a new horizon line far above, and this is where we'll put our vanishing point. Now, you can put this third vanishing point above your initial horizon line or below it, depending on what kind of shot and composition you're going for. But this will be our new guide when we're drawing lines indicating height. Instead of a straight vertical line that just goes straight up or down, which leads to more graphic shots, we're actually going to converge them into our third vanishing point above. As I did for the previous examples, I'm going to draw boxes throughout the canvas. Now our third vanishing point acts as a guide for the height lines. Now we've contained all of our vanishing points in this little triangle composition, in that the perspective and building blocks that we draw align to these vanishing points. And the way I like to think about it, these vanishing points actually give us a new set of rules that we have to follow, that constrain our world into rules. Now, I personally don't really do 3-point perspectives just because I don't really do anything that has forced perspective or fisheye, but it's something that you might want to know in case you're put in a spot where you have to think about at least 3 vanishing points. Now that we've explored different vanishing points, we can compose them in a frame or an image. In most images that have perspective information in them, some of those vanishing points are not seen or visible in the frame, but that's also because they extend way beyond the limits of the image or the frame, or what you see. Take the practices you've done with some of your perspective and vanishing point studies and frame them in interesting compositions. You can have 1 vanishing point in the frame, or 2 vanishing point in the frames, or sometimes none of the vanishing points are in the frame, they're all outside the frame. Sometimes I use these types of compositions for close-ups. You'll notice that if you frame your compositions above or below the horizon line, it kind of changes the point of view or direction of where you're looking. So if I put my frame above the horizon line, I'm kind of looking up. If I put my frame below the horizon line, it gives the impression I'm looking down. These are how illustrations or images use perspective. So what if the vanishing points are too close to each other? And this was something that I talked about early on. It can lead to a fisheye result, which means everything is so compressed. While it could be great for stylized forced perspective shot, it can also be jarring when it's not intended. It can make everything feel claustrophobic, or it can break the proportion of things. If you do CG or 3D, you'll notice that if you shrink the lens length, things become way more shortened and forced. So at the top of my head, there are 2 ways to figure this out. One is to space out your vanishing points as far away from each other, so you can get more space and more wider shots, or more wider perspective. Or you take whatever arrangement you have for your current vanishing points and align your overall set or composition focusing on 1 vanishing point. So most of my scene or set really just takes place in 1 vanishing point, and all the other vanishing points are outside of the frame. Once you've gotten the habit of the foundations of perspective drawing, you can basically shorthand it for thumbnailing or rough sketching. You could do a rough estimation of where the vanishing points are beyond the frame and just indicate it by lines. When I do my shorthands, I usually indicate a horizon line first and rough sketch the overall composition with background elements and characters. Then, looking at hints of the angles of walls and surfaces that I laid out, I would roughly indicate my perspective lines. Sometimes it's hard when the vanishing points are not present or extend way beyond the little thumbnail or drawing, so I have to resort to my rough lines to indicate where the vanishing points could be. I kind of have to do a rough estimate of it. One thing that I do sometimes is I draw 1 perspective line that's far away from the horizon line and then use that as a reference for my in-between perspective lines. After that, I'll do a later pass, and that could be a cleanup or a more rough sketch stage or a tie down. I could do a pass where I just try to figure out the actual perspective with vanishing points present. So I would probably take my rough drawing and put it in a huge canvas where I can indicate that possible vanishing point or any other vanishing point that's way beyond the shorthand. Something that I would also encourage you guys to do is to do a little reverse engineering. So I would say trace from real life pictures and try to find the perspective lines and vanishing points and the horizon line by tracing the angles of the walls. Some are easier to spot, whereas some can be much more complicated, especially when there's a lot of walls and surfaces in different angles. So let's find an example. This is an image where everything shares the same horizon line, but all the buildings and walls are all oriented differently from each other. So here's me trying to find the horizon line in this complicated shot. I'll just take 1 angled wall and trace the lines for the top and bottom parts of that wall or building. I'm going to keep following the line until these 2 touch. That would indicate my vanishing point, but let's find another thing to reference off. I will find another wall or reference to help me indicate another vanishing point. To make the horizon line, I'm just going to connect these 2 vanishing points together and stretch that line as much as I can. But look, in an image like this, there's a lot of different sets, surfaces, and walls and buildings that are all angled differently from each other. They all have their own different vanishing point. And some of these buildings might actually share the same vanishing point. But look, the thing that I wanted to get across is it's about just knowing the horizon line, the vanishing points, grid lines, and how it all works. Again, it can be as simple as possible or as complicated as possible. I'm someone who wants to go for the simple route. But if you want to go more complex, perspective is such a huge world that there are a lot of applications that can be used with perspective. So when I do talk about perspective again in the future, I do want to talk about how I use perspective for my animation work, how I use it for my storyboarding work, as well as using perspective techniques to perform visual math, such as keeping proportions consistent, or using perspective tools to draw more unique shapes aside from just blocks and squares. Anyways, that's all. Bye.
Interested in learning hand-drawn animation or learning how to finish an animated shot from beginning to end? Have a look at the store where you'll find the complete Introduction to 2D Animation video course, tutorials, and other resources. Learn classical animation approaches, drawing, lectures, techniques, and other process videos. Visit the store through the link in the description below.